So in 2026, everything changes for what it means to develop software. And in fact, everything has actually already changed. However, you have some time to really capitalize on this opportunity before the general public catches up with where the technology is actually at. So you can essentially automate the process of software development now and leveraging frameworks, leveraging AI agents, and leveraging the tools on the market, you can develop all types of software that would have taken weeks, months, in some cases, even years to do. In this video, I want to show how I've been able to leverage some of these tools and begin creating my own frameworks in order to automate software and automate workflows in my own business and for others. There's a concept that has quickly become popularized and has run rampant on the Twitter sphere or X that is a real indication of where everything is going over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. And that is the Ralph loop. So, to provide some context around this, Ralph is a process of mimicking or mirroring the human element that goes into developing features in software. It was conceived by a guy named Geoffrey Huntley, who's been putting out a lot of videos lately on this Ralph concept. And it's kind of a part of a whole infrastructure that he's building around autonomous software development. And it's named after the Simpsons character, Ralph Wiggum. Ralph Wiggum in The Simpsons. And I wasn't a huge Simpsons viewer growing up. I've obviously seen a couple of episodes, but if you are familiar with The Simpsons, then you know Ralph Wiggum was someone who was very sort of basic in his thinking, but would have these moments of just brilliance. And the idea of Ralph is you take these user stories when you're building out software and you keep running a loop of implementing these user stories until you implement it successfully within what you're building. I also want to shout out Ryan Carson, who has also been doing a lot of videos and tweeting heavily about this Ralph concept. And he did a video several weeks back how he's been implementing it into his work. And it was very helpful for me in sort of creating a framework that is helpful within my own workflow. And so to unpack Ralph further, I have drawn out here the flowchart of what actually happens in order to run it end to end. And using this system, I was actually able to build autonomously this Bitcoin web app that is a curriculum for going from a beginner to proficient in Bitcoin that includes authentication and also included a payment rail. And this is something that was, by the way, completely experimental, that at the time of building it, I had no intention of actually launching it. Still don't to this point, unless that interest is there. But basically, a friend of mine asked him to give me an idea, a web app idea to build using this Ralph system. And this is what it came up with. And I actually recorded the process. I triggered the Ralph loop before going to sleep. And I woke up in the morning with a finished web app product. It took about 2.5 hours for it to go end to end. We'll discuss what that process actually was and what was actually happening in that process. But it was about 2.5 hours from beginning to end of completing the product. My video timer ran out at about 4 hours, 45 minutes, but it was about 2.5 hours to actually finish the product. Now, let's talk further about Ralph. So autonomous coding, the Ralph loop. Well, now if you think about how teams typically operate when building software, especially if there's actually a team of people working on a product, you'll start with a PRD, product requirements document, which is basically an overview of what is going to get built. And you're defining the different features, you're defining what will be a part of the process and what needs to be implemented. And if you have a team of people, each of those members will be responsible for or will be a part of taking that PRD, that product requirements document, and implementing the different parts of it. Now, you also have what are called user stories, And in the case of the Ralph loop, you convert the PRD into a PRD.json, which basically are different user stories that you can take and then go ahead and implement. So one of the key pieces to the PRD when it gets converted to PRD.json is that the user stories need to be small enough for the agent to actually be able to fully implement. So typically, when you're implementing these user stories, this is something that you or I would actually be doing. In this case, the agent, so that may be Claude Code, that may be Codex, that may be AMP, that may be whichever agent is taking that story, the user story, and then it's going through the process of implementing that story, right? Creating that feature in the product, and it'll then save the changes, right? Update the prd.json, so this file that has a list of all the user stories. It'll then write notes, so it'll log what it learned to a file called progress.txt, which you can kind of think of as like short-term memory. And then it'll also update an agents.md file, which you can kind of look at as the long-term memory. Just kind of things to keep in mind as it's going along. And if there are more stories to implement, then it'll go ahead and it'll take another user story and go through that process again. Once it's gone through all the stories, then it's complete. Now, the loop itself is that process of taking the user story, implementing it, and if it doesn't get it correct, then it has to do it over again. And determining whether it gets it correct or not is based on what are called acceptance criteria. So it has basically a checklist of things that it needs to adhere to, that needs to get passed. And if it does, it passes that test for that user story and then moves on to the next one after making the updates and logging what it's been directed to. And so you can create the number of times that it's actually going to loop around. So that may be 10 times. It'll loop around up to 10 times before moving on from implementing that particular user story. And that's where the connection to Ralph Wiggum comes in, because it's basically like a very simple loop, and it's kind of like banging its head on a wall until it kind of gets it right, while being able to also document its learnings to make that next iteration more informed. Now, I want to convey that this is a framework, right? And the meat of this includes the Ralph loop itself, of course, but it's also just the idea of being able to leverage AI agents now to get work done. And that might look different for different people. And so now with the sort of agent skill standard that has been set by Anthropic, that now OpenAI, that now Google through its anti-gravity are beginning to adopt, you can create these different skills to implement all sorts of workflows and processes, including this Ralph loop. And so that's what we're getting into next. Okay, so I'm in the project files for the Bitcoin web app that I built, and I kind of give a high level overview of the process that I went through. Right, we started with creating a PRD, the product requirements document. We then converted it to a PRD.json for the user stories. So that's this right here, where you literally see, right, 001, 002, 003. These are all user stories that got created through this process. And these are the parts that got implemented with the Ralph loop. And then you have the actual Ralph script itself. It's what's called a bash script. So bash, for those who don't know, is basically a way of a language that consists of interacting directly with your computer's terminal. And in the agentic world, in the agent world, right, bash allows for more nuanced kinds of implementation, I would say. And I don't want you to get intimidated if you consider yourself non-technical, or you're unfamiliar with how these IDEs or the terminal works, because the AI agent is actually what created the script. And it's something that you're able to prompt for through the skills that get created. And we're going to go a little bit further into that as well. But once you have that PRD.json, you're able to now run this script. You're able to prompt the agent to run this script, and then it'll implement one of the user stories through the PRD.json. It'll then go in after finish implementing it and passing the acceptance criteria, update the PRD.json, log what it learned in the progress.txt file, as we explained. That's what we got right here. Update the agents.md file, as we explained, right? That's what we got right here, long-term memory, and then go in, take the next user story and implement that. And we have a skill to actually go about implementing it. Now, the skill situation can get a little bit confusing, right? Because this skill standard has been adopted by OpenAI now. It's been adopted by Google through anti-gravity, but it was created and set by Anthropic, the skill standard. And these skills are basically just files, right? Or folders rather, that have files in them with instructions for a specific action to take place. The action may be a workflow. The action may be to create some sort of page. That may be anything really. And the way I like to look at the skills is, if you think of the agent as a person working with or for you, the skill is kind of like the what it's cultivated, right? When you think about skill in real life, skill is something that you've developed over time, that you've become good at. So think about an agent having this information or an understanding in a specialty that it's become or that it is good at. And so you can have a skill for, in this case, we're talking about implementing the Ralph loop or system. You can have a skill for that. You can create a skill for that. You can have a skill for making the front end of an application more aesthetically pleasing. When this first got built, it didn't actually look like this. There is a skill that I'll implemented into my IDE that is specifically just for going onto an app and redesigning it or enhancing the design to be more polished and sophisticated. So it's a front end skill. You have skills for that can go and test the app on your browser, right? We'll talk about that, the dev browser skill. You have all sorts of skills. And in fact, as I mentioned, Anthropic is who has set this skill standard. And so if you go on to skillsmp.com, you can actually go and see a list of over 70,000 skills in the skill agent skills marketplace by Anthropic. And these skills range from everything from a writer to concept workflows and skills for data, for security and testing, for blockchain, all sorts of skills. And you even have skill creators where you can create a skill that creates skills, or well, the skill creator is typically something that's kind of by default already sort of there. Now, not to digress, I bring up the skills because this is how all of this actually got implemented through these skills. And so I developed a number of skills, both for Codex and for Claude Code, that can implement this. And so Codex, for example, you have the Codex extension here. You also have the terminal that you can use. I'm in my Cursor platform right now. You also have the terminal that you can use as well. And in that terminal, you can run Codex, which is OpenAI's coding model. You can also run Claude Code, which is, of course, from Anthropic. And within Codex, so let's take the Codex extension here. If you click on /, it'll actually bring you down to the skill installer and the skill creator. And so here are the skills that I've implemented thus far. One of them includes Ralph, right? So if I want to run Ralph, I can just select that skill and ask it to run for me. Same thing with Claude Code. If I click on /, I type in skills and click enter, it'll show me all my available skills. And one of them includes Ralph. Now, how did I implement these skills? Well, I mentioned that you have a skill creator. So I can click on the skill -creator and ask it to implement a skill. And I just have to kind of describe what I want to implement. I actually have I have a number of GitHub repos now where I've been accumulating skills. I mentioned also you have the skill marketplace through Anthropic where you can implement them as well. But what I want to emphasize is just the understanding of the logic around all of this, and really being able to get sort of understand step by step why each of these things are being implemented, because that's what's going to allow you to get the outcome that you're looking for the particular use case that you have. Anthropic, for example, came out with a Ralph plugin that you can use and that you can implement and that you could turn into a skill, for example. But after having gone through a lot of the research on my own and having gone step by step through everything, I understand that the Anthropic plugin for Ralph actually defeats the purpose, at least as how it was created at this time, defeats the whole purpose for Ralph, because one of the important parts about Ralph is the fact that every single time it takes a new user story, it'll actually create a whole new instance, whether that's a new Claude Code instance, whether that's a new Codex instance. Instances being the chat, like you can think of it as like the composer, where you are prompting and where it's getting the context from. That instance gives it a fresh context. So something that you have to be mindful of as you're coding with AI is context rot at a certain point, especially if you have a smaller context window, right? And a Claude Code, Opus 4.5, Claude Code context windows only 250-ish thousand tokens. So that has to be accounted for when going through the process. And unless you understand why you're doing what you're doing and understand the logic of it, then it may not register for you. And so that's also one of the reasons why the user stories need to be small enough. The feature itself needs to be small enough so that it can fit the size of the context window. Now, if you are interested in learning more about these agents and getting the templates and the skills and the frameworks I've been putting together for this with Ralph, we have them for Codex, we have them for Claude Code specifically right now, and other sort of related areas with vibe coding and AI agents. Right, we've also got the Anthropic Agent SDK that is very relevant for how you can go about building agent apps and agentic applications. Then take a look at Vibe Code Pioneers. The link to that will be in the description below. But so to get further into this and just to kind of speak on the process further, when you're implementing this Ralph system, what you will do is you'll come into Codex or you'll come into Claude Code. So I have them both opened up here. And the reason why I have both opened up is because number one, I feel like, there's a whole like Claude Code kind of hype going on right now where everybody is just like obsessed with Claude Code. Rightfully so. Like I've actually mostly been using Claude Code recently, but I want to also just make the point that Codex can do the same kind of thing. And it also has skills as well. So you would come in here and you would just type in what you want to build. For this Bitcoin app here, for example, what I did was I came in and I literally described what I wanted to build. So I asked it to use the PRD skill to help me build this Bitcoin education app. And then what it does is it'll ask you a couple of questions around it. And so, I'll type in, skills. I would and so I'll just say, using the PRD skill help me, get started with building a Bitcoin education. And basically it would ask me like 3 to 5 questions around what exactly am I building and why, and what I want to be a part of the tech stack. And we'll get started with actually kind of setting the scope of everything. And then once that is set, I can then ask it to use the Ralph skill to go about implementing it. And so it'll then ask me if I want to convert the PRD to the PRD.json, and then it'll go ahead with the process of implementing Ralph. Now, there are other aspects you have to consider in all of this, right? Because you also have to think about, okay, well, how's your back end getting implemented? What about your payments? What about, deployment? What about all these other things? Well, so something I've really liked a lot lately for my back end is insforge.dev. So insforge is kind of like a super base, but for agentic coding. And I've gotten really great results thus far. I've been using it for multiple projects up until now. And this is actually what I use for this build out. And so it has actually an MCP connection. MCPs, again, kind of like AI agents, plugins for your AI agents. It's literally a matter of just copying and pasting a short command into your IDE. So you would copy and paste that command here. It'll then now integrate it into your build. And so then that will directly connect your project with the backend, and it'll now actually be able to, agent will be able to go about creating different tables and the database and even the authentication. And that can actually be a part of that process that gets run. And that was exactly what happened. Same thing with Stripe. Stripe also has an MCP server. So you can directly integrate payments through this process as well. I will say I ran into a little bit of an issue when I did that. So when the app was completed, I noticed that uh, when I tried to pay, it took me to the authentication, but then after I signed in, it didn't take me to a payment page. It actually took me back to the home page. Or when I was just simply signing in, even after payment, it wasn't taking me to the dashboard. It was taking me to back to the home page. And so if I were to sign in now, let's say I sign in now with my actual account that I have created in here, you'll see that it has the whole kind of curriculum that got created, which is pretty cool that this was actually all built by the agent while I was sleeping. Now, it's not perfect, right? And that is something that you may not necessarily want to or need to like build the software end to end, right? Like this, you have a sort of modularity now that maybe you're using this to build a feature in your software. Maybe you're using this to build, 2 or 3 features, and that's what you're using Ralph for. Maybe you want to have some control over your back end or payments get integrated but it's the fact that you can now start to offload some of the work that you do to the agents, and it is really good at reading documentation and understanding what can and can be done by different third-party platforms and tech tools and that you use. And so really take advantage and capitalize on that and implement these skills. As I said, it's really a matter of just actually asking it to implement a skill. You can find GitHub repos. As I mentioned, we'll have them in Vibe Code Pioneers. You can find through the Anthropic skills. You can find through now OpenAI and anti-gravity skills, all different kinds of cases for whatever it is that you're looking for. And you can really start to have your agents running for hours on end. Now, in future videos, I'm going to be covering more about how to really leverage Codex and Claude Code for especially as vibe coders, right? So I came from an AI native background where I started coding through vibe coding, and I'm now at a point where I'm very comfortable with the terminal, to the point where now it's like I'm starting to get even to using the terminal just directly on the computer and not even just within the IDE. And having an understanding of the skills, having an understanding of the other aspects of agents is very essential, right? Because you have agents as far as sub agents. When it comes to Claude Code, you have the skills, you have slash commands. There are all these different areas that are just coming into the zeitgeist right now that is completely new. And those who learn these skill sets, those who learn these strategies, those who learn the techniques are going to be untouchable. And so I hope this was helpful. As I mentioned, 2026 is the year where everything changes, and things have already changed. I encourage you to implement a skill today. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to download a Cursor or download an anti-gravity, download one of these IDEs if you're not yet using them, and really start to identify parts of your operations or processes that you can make life easier for yourself with these agents or skills. And so that's everything I got for you today. I will see you guys on the next one.